Hi, this is Dr. Sana Hashmi. I'm a fellow at Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation. And this week in my Print on China column, I analyzed the Chinese discourse on the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's recent address to the nation, where he urged the Indian citizens to use products that are made in India. So, a new version of a Swadeshi movement that he urged Indian citizens to go for. So, of course, there's a lot of discussion in on the Chinese internet by economists, strategic community, and this is also because India and China are two Asia's giant. They are neighbors, they are rivals, trading partners. Huge trade imbalance that India has been facing for a number of years. But then China has been the world's factory for a long time now, and India is now trying to want to be the next world's factory, manufacturing hub of the world. So, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi urged citizens to buy made in India, the message wasn't just for Indian consumers, customers. It carried across borders all the way to Beijing, and their economist commentators are asking questions such as: Is India really on the path to become the next global manufacturing powerhouse? Is it moving towards self sufficiency, self reliance? Or is this just the dream that is going to be weighed down by issues such as bureaucracy, bottlenecks, and dependence on others, particularly China and the United States? So, from iPhones assembled in Tamil Nadu to solar modules imported from China, India's industrial journey is being watched very closely in Beijing. But there is both caution as well as admiration. So, Chinese analysts frame Prime Minister Modi's Make in India push as more than economics. Against the backdrop of the trade tension with the US, the sanctions that have been imposed by Donald Trump, they see it as both a strategic messaging as well as policy incentive. And in fact, on a Weibo microblogging website in China, some praise Prime Minister Modi's tough stance against US President Donald Trump. And then some of the posts also suggested that India wants to reduce its reliance on Washington. So, this entire idea that India US trade relations are going to be back on track is something that is not really gaining a lot of traction in on the Chinese internet. So, if we dig deeper on the Chinese internet, the message is pretty clear that India is India's 1.4 billion strong market is asserting its autonomy. It is hoping to influence global supply chains through both consumer behavior as well as industrial policy. But of course, there have been hurdles as well, and according in the Chinese view, the hurdles are daunting. Manufacturing's share of India's GDP has slipped from 15% to around 14% now. The Chinese internet is saying that the job creation is limited, and only a fraction of the 1.7 billion in PLI has actually been disbursed. So there are bright spots such as in the sector, such as in the mobile phones and pharmaceuticals, but then other sectors such as textile, steel, solar, they continue to struggle. So in this context, Chinese analysts point to structural weaknesses. And we have been hearing about this for a number of years, for decades, in fact. The standard criticism weaknesses about India's um, in about India, and that are red tapeism, poor center state coordination, weak enforcement, slow courts, and an underskilled workforce. And to quote Chao Wei, who's a financial and macroeconomics commentator, he argues that India's political and governance weakness weigh heavily on its willingness for further industrialization. And there was this example that was also quoted with respect to the auto sector, which, according to them, illustrate the problem. And one of the examples that was given was of the General Motors. Its drawn out exit from India, delayed for years by unions and bureaucracy, revealed they believe that it revealed the country's costly exit barriers. But by comparison, economies like Singapore, Germany, and the UK handle such transitions more smoothly. So even though Prime Minister Modi is warning that dependence on the foreign countries for goods and imports is India's greatest economy, It is seen in China as more aspirational than reality. And there were a number of commentaries and posts that said that 10 years into Make in India, that was launched in 2014, the country still imports 90% of its chips, 70% of its fighter jets, and most pharmaceutical ingredients and solar modules. And in fact, China is one of the most important, significant importers for India. So many of these products actually come from China itself. Um, and also, one of the examples that was highlighted was how India's defense modernization is based on foreign components and arms and equipment. So this is also specifically after Operation Sindoor that has come into limelight in within the Chinese discourse. And then, apart from that, external shocks underline the vulnerability. Russian arms delay, US tariffs, then reliance on Chinese inputs are some of the major examples and hurdles. For many Chinese commentators, slogans, in one of the articles, it was mentioned that slogan cannot replace structural reform. And without deeper changes and reforms, they argue that Atmanirbhar Bharat, self reliant India, risk remaining a myth. It is not going to be a model. And one Weibo post also put it bluntly that the dreams look sweet as of now, but reality is bitter. And achieving this dream is going to be a little bit difficult than it is expected, it is anticipated. But then, of course, the story doesn't really end with just criticism. There are a number of Chinese analysts who also recognize India's emerging competitiveness. And one post summed it up: India's playbook that import machinery and raw material from China, it assemble it locally, and then it export it to Europe and the US. So step by step, India is actually building a global made in India supply chain. And its advantages are very clear. India has a young, low cost workforce that is fluent in English. And at the same time, now China is facing rising wages and trade frictions. That actually opens a window for India to climb. But then, of course, these are some of the advantages that India has and that have been well recognized within the Chinese discourse as well. Still, the optimism is tempered. And to quote Chang Yi, who is from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, he warns that too many of these new jobs and the workers are low quality and unskilled. That would risk wasting talent, and that would actually hamper India's capability to prove itself as the next manufacturing hub of the world. And others also highlight technological bottlenecks, yet in sectors like computers, base metals, electrical equipment, and cars, India is absolutely showing real promise. And one of the examples, and I think one of the most effective examples, is that of the Apple supply chain. The shift is very much visible in Apple supply chain. In fact, with the recently launched iPhone 17, India now assembles nearly half of the units that were sold in the US in the recent time. And for iPhone 17, China's share has dropped to a quarter. And Chinese analysts are actually calling this the dual center model. India's is rising, and India rising as an assembly hub while China retains control over high value production. But as I've also already mentioned, that this is just and Prime Minister Modi's announcement was also, and the development that have been happening in the supply chain arena, they aren't just about economics. Geopolitics plays just bigger role as economics. And there was this article in which some of the Chinese economists, they wrote that the global supply chain is no longer a single world factory, but a China plus N plus one model. And in this model, ASEAN countries, some of the ASEAN countries such as Vietnam, India, and Mexico are taking over labor intensive production. But China, meanwhile, is doubling down in intermediate goods and high tech industries. So, and yet, most of the analysts and economists in China agree that a full because of this interdependence, a full de-risking from China isn't really realistic in the short to mid-term. And China still has unmatched scale, skilled labor, and investment capacity. And India may perhaps seize short-term gains, but China's ecosystem ensures long-term dominance. And still, India's rise is viewed not, I would say, not that negatively as it used to be. There is absolutely this sense of optimism in Chinese discourse with respect to India, and also this fear that India might be able to match up to the Chinese level in times to come, and India may rise as an effective competitor to China, and as healthy competition that spurs Beijing to perhaps upgrade faster. In the end, Chinese commentary reflects caution, admiration. India is ambitious, India is innovative, and it is increasingly influential in global trade. But of course, as I've already mentioned, systemic inefficiencies and uneven execution still hold it back. This is what the consensus of the Chinese internet and strategic community and among economists were. So, India may not yet rival China's manufacturing dominance as of yet, but the consensus is that it is becoming a serious player. And in Beijing, that rise is being watched very closely. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.